Hey everyone, and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Melissa Reed and I am a mixed media artist from southwestern Pennsylvania. And we're taking a break from the florals that I've been doing for the last few weeks. I just wanted to change it up a little bit so it doesn't get stale. So we're just doing a mixed media collage like I have done in the past. This time we are working on a 6" by 12" cradled board, which I have primed with gesso. And the first color that I put down there was a little bit of Golden Acrylics Azo Gold, which is one of my favorite colors. If you don't have this in your collection, I highly recommend it. It is just such a beautiful color. It's very similar to Burnt Sienna, but it has just a little bit more warmth and depth to it. On top of that, I added a couple of drops of the Golden Fluid Acrylics Titan Buff. I'm going to keep this color palette pretty warm. The last several collage pieces that I did with the flowers, I used that black, white, and pale pink color combo, which I really love, but it's a fairly cool combination and I wanted to really keep it warm with this one. So I went in with those colors that I mentioned along with a little bit of the Liquitex Basics Burnt Sienna Fluid Acrylic, and now I'm using a bit of the Grumbacher Red, which is one of my absolute favorite reds, and I'm just using these colors in combination. I'm randomly putting them down to create this warm background. Now, if you've been here before, you know that I am an intuitive artist, which basically just means that I don't like to go into my work with too much of a plan. Sometimes I'll have a little bit of a color scheme or maybe one basic idea, but I really like to just start working and see what the piece tells me that it wants to be. So I am just going in with the paint in that manner now, and wherever it looks like it might need a little color added, I'll add it, whatever feels right in the moment that I'm making it. That's how I kind of choose what I'm doing. Once I get all these colors blended into the background, I'm going to go in and make some design decisions. So right now I'm not 100% sure what I'm going to be doing, but I do know that I'm going to want to create a darkness around the edges. So after I add in a little bit more brightness, which I am using this Benzimidazolone yellow, I think I might have pronounced that correctly, but I'm not sure. I will put a link to that and everything else in the description for you. I really love this color. It is something that I picked up at Michael's. Actually, it's a golden acrylic. It's just a really nice yellow. It brightened everything up for me and added that bright pop of warmth. So I have a little bit of Mars Black spread out on my paper plate there, which has been very well loved. I like to use them until they fall apart, basically. And what I'm doing is just going in with my color shapers and moving that paint around with the help of a little bit of water. Again, I don't know exactly what I'm doing here. I just really kind of want some squarish or rectangular shapes in the background, and this was a good tool to do that. I like the way that when you get that paint wet, the color shaper is basically like a little squeegee, and it will remove as much as you want it to as well. So it's leaving me with these nice marks that give the hint of square or rectangular shapes, but I'm able to like kind of clear out the middle of them, if that makes sense to you. And I just really like the way that looks. So I still don't really know what direction I'm going to go in, but because I have these kind of squarish shapes, I'm tossing around using my handmade stencil that has all of the squares on it. And if you haven't seen that video, I will put it on my end screen for you, and you can click there and check it out if you want. I made this stencil out of a piece of Duralar, which is just a sheet of plastic basically, and I cut my squares out with an X-Acto knife. And I'd been wanting a stencil that looked like this for a while, and I sure could have gone and bought one, but I figured I had the means to make it myself, and art supplies are expensive, so I did go ahead and do this, and I'm going to show it to you here in a minute. I'm going to go in using that stencil with a little bit of modeling paste, and what that's going to do is cause the texture to really be ramped up there, because this is, think of modeling paste kind of like plaster, but for art. So If you used regular plaster on a canvas, specifically a canvas, but even on a wooden board like this, it's not meant to adhere to that surface, so there's a danger of it cracking and falling off. But if you use the modeling paste, that's not going to happen. So there's the stencil that I was talking about, and you can see that I cut out all those little squares by hand, which was super tedious, and I had a very, very sore hand when I was done. But I use this all the time, and I haven't regretted making it even for a second. So I have this offset spatula that I like to use to apply the modeling paste to my projects, and you'll notice I'm not going in and being precise. So I don't want just a big square of squares on there. I want to just kind of put them randomly and not even worry about each individual square being whole. I want the idea of the brokenness. So these squares are mimicking the square shape that I have in the background. And my plan for this at this point is once these dry, which will take a couple of hours at least, but I typically like to let it sit overnight when I'm using the modeling paste. I just want to make really sure that everything is dried out before I put the next coat on when I use this. So what I will do then is go over the top of that with paint. Not exactly sure at this point which kind of paint I'm going to use. I'm just trying to get all those squares on there in the position that I want them. And I'll let that sit overnight. Typically that's something that I do. I will let a piece sit overnight, and when I go back and look at it, if I'm feeling stuck or not 100% sure where I want to go, just having a little bit of distance and space from it will often get me there. One nice thing about the modeling paste is that until it dries, you can go in and clean up any errors like I'm doing right here. I just have a wet paper towel and I'm wiping up some spots that got smudged and where I deposited a little bit of it that I didn't want to get down there. I could go in and wipe out an entire section if I wanted to. I could use, actually my color shaper would be great to do that and just wipe it completely off. Okay, so now that the piece has dried, and I also wanted to let you know that I went in and hit that with some sandpaper. Not a real fine grit, but not somewhere mid-range. I can't remember what the number is. I don't have it handy. But you just want to take down the burr that's on the top of that so that nothing will scrape anyone or anything. So now I'm going over the top with some of the Liquitex Burnt Sienna. This is just to create a little bit more depth and warmth. It's covering up some of those squares underneath, but that's what I want. So I like to work in layers. I think it makes everything look a lot more visually interesting, and I wanted to get some of those covered up. Because I don't necessarily know what I'm going to be ending up with or what choices that I might make in the future, sometimes I can't necessarily plan for the layering, but that's okay. I'm going to show you what I mean here in a little while with something that I decided to add on after the fact, but it all worked out because of the technique that I used. So I'm just taking a damp paper towel here and wiping away some of the paint that's on the very tops of those high points in the texture, and that's creating a natural highlight. Just because it actually is a high point and because there was a lighter paint underneath, and I'm wiping away some of that darker paint that I just applied. Now I'm just going in and mimicking those squarish, rectangularish shapes that I put underneath with the color shaper, but in the burnt sienna on the top. And this is just carrying that idea over. When you're working in abstract, to have a successful abstract piece, at least in my opinion, it's important to keep in mind some of the fundamentals and foundational principles of art. And if you have a theme or a shape that carries through, that's one way to do it. And that's what I'm doing here with these squares. I've got them on the bottom layer with the paint. On top of that, I've got the square stencils in the modeling paste, and then I have them again here in the burnt sienna, and I'm just kind of going through and switching up the orientation of them here a little bit. I had most of them going up and down, and I'm going horizontal with them in certain areas too, just to create a little bit of interest while still having the same type of shape. And I'm using a little bit of that lovely yellow again just to create a very bright part in the center there. I just wanted that part to stand out, and that yellow is a nice opaque yellow, but I'm actually going to go in with just a tiny touch of titanium white. I just touched the tip of my dry brush to it, and because the yellow is still wet, it's mixing right there on the board, but it's creating that super bright focus point right there in the middle. And I got a little bit of paint on some of those outer areas there, but I'm just cleaning that up with a wet paper towel. And while I work on that yellow there, I just wanted to take a second and thank you. Thank you to everybody who subscribed to my channel this week. It has been a huge subscriber week, and I could not be happier about it. Thank you all so much. And if you haven't had a chance yet, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up if you like what you see. Okay, so I'm also taking that yellow and hitting the high points of the texture with the brush, but then I decided I'm going to go in with my color shaper. This is something that I like to do when I have a high texture point, because I can use that flat side of the color shaper and just kind of lightly lay paint right on the surface without worrying about getting it somewhere that I don't want it. Because, you know, if you use a brush, it's going to get down inside those little cracks and crevices that I created with the modeling paste, but using the flat surface there of the color shaper is going to stop that from happening, and it's only going to deposit the paint exactly where I want it on those high points. And along with that yellow, I did go in with a little more of the titanium white as well and added even more brightness to some of those areas. I just wanted to give just a hint more of a highlight just to a few of the places where the modeling paste was. So once this part is done, it's kind of decision time. The piece needs a focal point, and I'm not 100% sure still what I'm going to do, but I do realize that I wish there was a little more texture in that middle yellow part. So I'm going to go in and do a little bit of gel printing. I've got my 6" by 6" and my 3 by 5 plates there, and I'm just using a little bit of Mars Black paint and spreading it pretty thin on there. And what I'm doing is tearing some sheets of random text out of a couple different magazines. Not important at all what they say, you're not really going to even be able to read it. I'm just tearing some random shapes. It's important to get the shape, and I want the line where they meet, which you'll see there in a minute. You can see like the fractured paper look there. I want to get some of that into the print, and I'm laying down a little bit of my matte gel medium, and I'm going to pick this up with some tissue paper. The matte gel is going to ensure that it is a clear background. All you're going to see is the text printed on the tissue paper, and the tissue is used so that when I lay that down on the piece, it's going to melt right into the background. You're still going to be able to see it, but it's not going to be just like a big thick sheet of like copy paper or something sitting right on top of the surface, because for this particular thing, that's not what I want. So I'm just doing that again here. I'll show you again the matte medium. I'm brayering that out and then immediately just setting down some tissue paper, and I'm going to let that dry on there for a moment or two. And then I'll pick that up and you'll be able to see a nice print of the text. This is one of my favorite techniques. I really love using text in my pieces, and there's all sorts of different ways to do that. Maybe I will someday do a video on all the different ways, but you'll see me use this one quite a bit. Okay, so those sheets that I just printed now have the text on them, and I am going to randomly tear pieces off and decide on placement. This will take a few minutes because I don't know exactly what I want to do. I just know that I want to get some of that covered up, and I don't want it to be in a uniform manner. I don't want the whole thing covered, and I don't want same sized chunks either. I want it to be pretty random but yet still have a decent amount of coverage. So I have that small shape that I ripped up off of the top there and that larger shape in the middle, but I definitely wanted to get that nice line where the two pages intersected there and overlapped on the text sheets, and I got that there in the center. And there's a nice black line down that bottom piece too that printed up that I like, and I wanted to be able to use that. So after some fiddling and tearing more edges off there, I'm going to go ahead and glue that down. And what I'm going to use for that is some more of the matte gel medium that I used to pick up the print with. This is going to make everything stick down really nicely, and you're not going to be able to see it. It doesn't have any gloss to it. It's the matte one that I'm using this time. And you can kind of see how that paper just melts right into the background there. I am going to go in with an old gift card or credit card and smooth that down. And what actually is happening is I'm pulling away some of those edges too. I really like that frayed look. I didn't want anything to have a hard, perfect edge. So I'm actually going in with a pen and nib and purposely almost like picking away some of the edge to make it look even more frayed and tattered. I like to keep that pen and nib handy for that. It has so many good uses that it's kind of like one of my studio tricks that I use all the time. So I'm just going to repeat that process with the other two pieces and gluing everything down. And you'll notice that I put a layer of glue on the surface that I'm gluing to, and also another one on top, just to make sure that the collage piece is really anchored down there well. You definitely don't want to leave any loose edges that could possibly be, either picked apart on purpose by somebody or accidentally come loose. That's something that you want to make sure is anchored down really well. And when you put on the two coats like that, that will definitely stop that from happening. Plus, I also use an acrylic clear coat at the end, which is going to definitely ensure that nothing is coming up off of there. So I'm really liking the way that this is looking. It's looking kind of like a little bit grungy, which is a style that I love, and I will, on purpose, typically not clean my gel plate very well sometimes, just so that I can get some of those grungy, kind of worn out looking marks, I guess, on my prints. I had somebody comment once, "You need to clean your plate." I'm like, well, yeah, if I was trying to make beautiful prints, you're absolutely right, I would not be able to do that. But I'm not looking for beauty here. I'm kind of looking for paper that has lived a hard life, and that's how you get that. Okay, so now that these are glued down and dried, I thought that a little bit of the tissue paper was too white and kind of right there on the surface. So I'm going in and blending in some of the Azo Gold over the top of it. And I'm not looking to color the whole entire thing in. You'll notice that I'm leaving some patches of white on there randomly, but not a ton of it because I don't want it to look like it was just plopped down there. And because I am adding it after the fact and didn't really get to put any of that other paint or texture on top of it, that's a way to accommodate that. All right, so here I am with my birds. If you've watched my other videos, you know that I have a particular affinity for birds, especially ravens. I have made some stencils out of acetate sheets and also out of thin plastic sheeting called Duralar, and that's what I'm using here. So those two birds in my hands right now are actually the mask part that I cut out of the stencil, and I kind of just use those for placement to decide where I'm going to put down the ones that I'm going to paint right now. And I had that acetate sheet there, which has a couple different stencils cut into it. That's what I'm using for the top one, and I'm going in with a little bit of Grumbacher Payne's Gray that I have mixed with a large amount of the matte gel medium. And the Payne's Gray is pretty transparent to begin with, but adding the matte gel medium to any color will make it very much more transparent, and that's kind of what I was going for here. I didn't want just a solid black shape plopped down on the front. And you can see how some of the paint and therefore also the collage paper that's underneath that is going to be able to come out through that, and you'll be able to see it. This allows me to make the decision to go in and darken it in places if I want to, but it's very hard to unpaint something solid black once it is on there and dried. So that's why I like to do it this way. Then I can layer it on if I decide it needs a little more definition. But right now I'm just going in to change up the shape a little bit. So I did make those stencils myself, as I said. However, I don't really like to use stencils, especially realistic stencils of an object like a bird, exactly how they are. I like to go in and then further embellish or further alter it. It makes me feel more like I had more of an artistic hand in it, because if I just draw a stencil and then use it over and over again in different pieces, while there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, just for me, it feels a little more, I don't know, artisty, to make a word up, to do it this way. I like to be able to just change it and make it a little bit different. So even though I'm actually going to be using the same bird for each of the two that I'm doing here, I'm going to paint them so that they look slightly different. They're obviously both still going to be ravens, but they're not going to be identical cookie cutter ravens that I clearly used a stencil to place on there. Just another little trick that I do. I would hand paint the ravens from scratch, but I'm not doing that for two reasons do I make the stencils. First of all, I use ravens in a lot of my pieces, and it can become really tedious to try to get the perfect position and shape that you want every single time, especially if it's something I know I'm going to be using a lot of, so that's why I chose to make them. But also, for the sake of time in making these videos, because I do get really, really particular when I am drawing something out, and it can take me a while because I will just keep second guessing myself and starting over and not liking what I came up with, and it saves me a bunch of editing or you a bunch of boredom watching me do this over and over again. So I just tend to make stencils of things that I use frequently. So that bottom one that I just put on there, you notice that I traced around the stamp instead of painting into the stencil, just a different way of doing it. And I actually really like the way that turned out. I like that I can see that pen outline of the bird on the finished piece. I think it's another interesting quality. It's just another line quality that's on there and kind of added something to the piece. The birds are not highly detailed, and that was on purpose, but because that one has just that little bit of extra line to it, it looked more interesting. Okay, so I'm just finishing filling in the birds here, and then I'm going to go in and darken up some areas that I thought needed it. I'm taking a paper towel to remove a little bit of the paint that I laid down, which you can still do when it's wet, obviously. I'm doing this because I want a variation in the translucency of the birds. So while I do want a lot of paint in certain areas, I still want that background to be able to be seen through. Again, they are not really meant to be solid images laying right on top of everything else. I want them to blend in and be more a part of the whole entire piece, and that's just another way to achieve that. I make a decision after this to put one detail on the bird that stands out a little bit, and that is an eyeball. So I go in with a black Posca pen, which is an acrylic paint marker. These are great. If you don't have them in your collection, I highly recommend them. Lots of uses for those. And then I just take the end of my paintbrush and dip it in a bit of titanium white and tap it off a few times just so I can get a tiny white dot. And that's what I put for the highlight in the eye, and you'll see that here in just a second. And at this point, I'm pretty happy with the outcome. I'm going to go ahead and sign my piece, and then I decided to just do a tiny little bit of shading underneath the chest of the birds. The yellow was standing out a bit too much, and I wanted more of a transition to go in with the rest of the piece. So I just poured out a little bit of that burnt sienna in the Liquitex fluid and just went down around the perimeter of the bird's chest and stomach just to put a little shadow there. And I think it added a nice warmth to that area that made it not realistic, obviously, but just a little more dimensional in a way that I was looking for. And once I let everything dry, I took it outside and sprayed it with a nice coating of Krylon Triple Thick Acrylic Spray, and here is the finished product. Thank you all for joining me. This item is for sale on my Etsy shop, and there is a link in the description if you are interested in taking a look at that or any of my other pieces. And I am always so happy to have you here, and I'll be looking forward to talking to you again in another week. Have a great weekend and happy 4th of July.